Yeah, let me accept myself. There we go. All right. Yeah, thank you very much for the kind introduction and also the kind invitation to come speak with you all. So yeah, thank you, Andrea and Maria. Thanks to the University of Birmingham, I guess, for hosting this wonderful, exciting new series. My plan of action for today is to offer a brief overview of the scope and organization of the revised edition of my book, to introduce some high-level ideas about improvisation studies and the notion of complementarity, and then switch to maybe a more detailed exploration of some work on social cognition and coordination dynamics in improvised music. I'll do my best to kind of maybe rush through some slides I've prepared to keep the talk to about 45 or 50 minutes, because I do look forward to the Q&A and the discussion. I often find those to be some of the more enlightening moments in academic talks. And I wanted to say thanks to all of you for spending part of your, I guess, your evening with me, my morning, of course. All right, well, why don't we, I'm going to switch into presentation mode and we'll get started. Go over here. Why am I not getting to? Let's try this one more time. Here we go. Are you're not actually seeing my slide, are you? Why am I not getting it? Sorry.
We are seeing the slide.
Oh, you are seeing the slide, and just the slide. Yes. Okay, beautiful. All right, I wasn't seeing the little highlighted box around it. All right, well, there's the title, and as I said, I'll try to get to some of the more specific topics as we go. But I wanted to start with just some high-level ideas and just a general overview of the scope and organization of the book itself. I like to point out to folks that I was quite intentional that the subtitle of the book be Improvising Music and not Improvised Music. I mean, most people, I think, assume my book to be about musical improvisation, and in particular, so-called free improvisation. And I don't usually correct them if they have that notion, because the book certainly does engage that musical community and those musical practices, but at least the aspirations for the book were a bit grander, if you like, to explore and to articulate the improvisational dynamics of life and mind. And I did notice, and as Maria pointed out, that Vijay Iyer was going to give a talk next in this series, and I was also quite intrigued by his title, and I think in some ways that's what my subtitle was meant to signify as well, this idea of improvising music, to working through and even unthinking our preconceptions about the category of music, and instead to focus on its emergent and dynamic musicalities, as Vijay says. That being said, I guess most often the first question I do get when I'm asked to talk about the book is, what is improvisation? And I thought I would share sort of three driving questions, if you like, for the work that I did. I think improvisation is often conceived in a binary relationship with, or as the other of, composition, or notation, or interpretation, or maybe more recently, computation. So one of my driving questions was, can our thinking about improvisation move beyond these binaries, this dualism? Improvisation has also most often, I think, been addressed through methodological individualism and a kind of cognitivist paradigm. And so I think my book asks if we can shift to a systems-centered and ecological or enactive view of improvisation. Oops, sorry, I'm having it. There we go. And thirdly, so-called free improvisation is often defined in negative terms, either musically as avoiding or disavowing preset harmony, repeating song forms, steady and shared rhythm, standard instrumental sounds and techniques, or socially as rebelling against socio-political norms or the status quo. And of course, much of that work is wonderful, and I'll try to highlight it a bit as we go, but I also had this driving question of whether we could instead highlight the productive aspects of what I tended to call open form improvisation. Here's a Mobius strip trying to give a sense of the organization of the book. I guess the first substantive chapter after kind of the introductions starts at the what I would call the micro level, the 4E mind of the solo improviser. And then it works towards the meso level, the complex dynamics of an improvising ensemble, exploring things like the phase space of improvisation and the phenomenology of listening. Then maybe moves towards what we might call the macro level, network dynamics and entanglements involving social and technological agency. And there's maybe just a few of the theories that I explore. And then the final chapter comes around to essentially pedagogy, but I think also that's meant to highlight, and really the work throughout is meant to highlight the entanglement of these various micro, meso, and macro levels. But the final chapter is titled Harnessing Complexity, and it draws on some ideas in situated and distributed learning, since ultimately how we learn, how we're introduced to improvisation, then affects how we improvise both as soloists and in ensembles and in communities of practice. Here's that same Mobius strip with just a few of the, I guess you could call them cast of characters that appear throughout the book. Evan Parker, of course, is an important artist whose work and ideas are explored in the book. But also there's the chapter on ensemble dynamics talks about Sam Rivers' wonderful trio with Barry Altschul and Cecil McBee. Maybe some of the artists on the right-hand side of your screen are added to the revised edition of the work, but I spent some time talking to Peter Evans and a few of his collaborators, and also to Ritwik Banerjee and Mason Breton is a former student of mine who worked on the Shimon project at Georgia Tech. And I also drew more on some of my own experiences with electroacoustic improvisation with Jeff Kaiser and Kyborg. And then down there at the bottom are some of the wonderful improvisational pedagogues that contributed to the earlier edition as well. I won't go over all of this, but it was kind of fun for me to put together a single slide that highlighted my theory toolkit. And as just a quick glance might give you a sense that I've tried to read widely as I can in both kind of the new sciences, but also the new humanities and new musicology, if you like. And this idea, maybe you've encountered it yourselves. I'm starting to encounter it with more frequency, but the idea of research is me-search. And I actually am quite comfortable embracing that idea that, ultimately researchers in both the humanities and the sciences are drawn to specific topics that interest them and challenge them. I think one of the obvious challenges we all face is how to integrate this insight from so many diverse disciplines. I'll share just briefly, there's a wonderful series of lectures that David Huron gave at UC Berkeley a number of years back, but he talks about two types of skeptics, essentially the sciences and the humanities. And I think anybody, involved in the academic enterprise is probably a skeptic in the positive sense of that word, but in the sciences, the skeptics tend to be theory discarding, right? Look for reasons to discard claims, avoid false positives. In the arts and humanities, the skeptics are theory conserving, wary of evidence purporting to disprove a theory, avoid false negatives, value sensitive observation and interpretation. And what Huron is highlighting, of course, is something that C.P. Snow, highlighted more than 50 years ago now in the idea of two cultures. The first chapter of the book is titled The Sound and Science of Surprise. And in some ways, it was this dual interest in the humanities and sciences that led me to the topic to begin with, but more specifically, how contemporary music, and improvisational music in particular, has been called the sound of surprise. Whitney Balliet in 1959, famously described jazz as the sound of surprise. And in 1994, John L. Castee wrote a nice book kind of bringing together insight from these new sciences of chaos and complexity and criticality and catastrophe theory and these, in some ways, rather ominous sounding fields, but he called them the sciences of surprise. But this idea of two cultures is I think, an ongoing challenge, and I'm never sure how much progress we've made in the intervening years. This idea of paradox, though, I thought I would explore briefly, because I think one thing that fascinates listeners and artists to improvised music are some of the paradoxes that are raised in the practice of improvisation. And as John L. Casty mentioned, some of these new sciences are trying to explore and interrogate some of at least the binary thinking that informs our concepts of paradox. There was a wonderful book I read a few years back by Paul Rinzler called The Contradictions of Jazz. And just briefly, you can probably just look at these figures I grabbed from his book. But he gives a nice sense of how we too often, I think, get stuck in the idea that a contradiction is a mutual exclusion, right? It's one or the other. Actually, there's a very famous early essay by Francisco Varela called Not One, Not Two, which is, I think, a nice way to be thinking about some of these ideas. But, Rinzler points out there's many different ways to think about contradiction, and ultimately he arrives at this idea of dynamic tension. Here I give the maybe well-known quote by F. Scott Fitzgerald that the test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two opposing ideas in the mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function. This is a kind of visual that I put together based on Rinzler's work. And again, maybe I won't spend a lot of time unpacking it, but I think just looking at it, you can get a sense of how often I think we're too quick to see terms like individualism and interconnectedness, or assertion and openness, or freedom and responsibility, or creativity and tradition in a kind of mutually exclusive relationship, right? A contradiction of mutual exclusion. But what Rinzler points out, I think, quite well is that the actual negations of those words are the words with the asterisk next to them. But the words that he's chosen to put in dynamic tension are just that. They're sort of, I'm going to introduce this idea of complementarity in a second, but they're both imply, well, I guess I'll quickly shift to that idea that comes from the work of Scott Kelso and David Engstrom. They write complementarity, though contraries are diametrically opposed by definition, they are nevertheless coexistent, mutually dependent, and inextricable. And they introduced the sign, the tilde sign that you can find on your keyboard as a way of marking this complementary relationship between terms. This is just a quick passage from Sink or Swim, but the tendency for individual coordinating elements to couple or bind together, an integrative cooperating tendency, and the tendency for them to retain and express their independence, a segregating differentiating tendency, appears to be important to systems from brains to societies contributing to their metastability. And that's sort of another idea from Kelso and Engstrom, metastability. But I guess the take-home point is this idea that systems at all scales seem to have these dynamics in which individual elements are both binding together, integrating, but also finding ways to express their independence, differentiating themselves. And that runs from neurons, through social systems. To get a little closer to the musical discussion, as I mentioned, I think one thing that fascinates me and maybe others about so-called free improvisation are the sort of inherent paradoxes, or I'm going to call them complementarities. Just on a purely sonic level, if you like, the music seems to explore such a vast, diverse sonic territory, from the quietest to the most intense passages, from moments of incredible density to incredible sparseness. The music, often evokes a kind of seriousness, but also an incredible playfulness, disciplined, uninhibited. Again, maybe I won't read all of these, but I think you can see how these that might be seen as somehow contradictions or paradoxes could be seen as complementarities. In the more sociocultural realm, there are also many complementarities we could highlight. And often the thinking about free improvisation I think wonderfully sort of embraces, maybe the full spectrum of these ideas, from utopian to skeptical, from militant to spiritual, from democratic to anarchic, a kind of inclusive stance where, virtually anybody is welcomed into the musical ensemble, but also a kind of virtuosity and an exclusivity that makes it, at times one of the more challenging musics to enter into as a less experienced improviser. It can be hyper individualistic, but also collectivistic. It's essentializing, but also anti-essentializing in terms of, not sort of fighting against any generic associations that the music might have. Often historians of free improvisation talked about the various national scenes, of course, the African American community and the US context of free jazz, but within Europe, the British, the Dutch, the Germans, and more, these kind of national scenes that emerged. But ultimately, the music has, for many, a kind of cosmopolitan leaning as well. Some of this comes from a reading of Scott Saul's book, which I would recommend if you haven't looked at it previously. And I here highlight just that some of these complementarities are gaining a little more traction in the music academy. I think it's more common for folks to talk about themselves as composer-performers. But we could also talk about performer-listeners or listener-performers, in the sense that, every listening to this music and every listener is bringing, sort of bringing a sense of meaning-making to the experience. I thought I'd show, this is maybe 5 or 6 minutes. It's a short film that was put together by The Guardian a few years back to highlight, well, as they call it, the underground nature of free improvisation, and free improvisation as a music that makes its own rules. But at least let's get some sounds in our ears if we can.
There are people that hear it once and say, never again. And there are people that hear it once and think, my God, what the hell was that? But they creep back because there's something that's connected for them. It's touched some part of their sense of what music can be. Is a very simple way of putting it. But what life can be, or what life is, I think that starts to communicate. There's a worldview perhaps involved which touches people.
When people say, isn't this some kind of a secret code that you've got between you, that you've developed this language which you understand, and maybe some of us don't understand? Well, it may appear to be like a secret code, but plenty of people have cracked the cipher. So what that means is that if you pay enough attention and you're interested enough, you can give it meaning. I mean, you do, and every listener does, of course, does that anyway. We all give meaning to all music we listen to. Part of the creativity is in the listener. And I think listeners often forget that listening is a creative experience.
Do I play for the audience? Yeah, sure. Am I going to think, if I do this, the audience is going to enjoy it more. No. And I certainly have done that, but no, don't need to, because you can feel people's concentration. The audience is going along with you. That's what's happening. Somehow that kind of communal thing works its little magic.
The last thing you need to do is rely on material that's already fixed in your mind. But if you don't have anything fixed in your mind, you have no starting point. That's the central paradox, really. The more control you have, the freer you are.
The best performances are the ones when you're not actually in control. You're just letting it happen. Having the facility to do it, but at the same time being not afraid to make a mistake. And I think out of alleged mistakes come quite interesting and maybe original stuff.
There's always been plenty of people who will say, you can't make mistakes, it's all okay. And I've always felt, well, no. And of course, actually, what all it means is with improvised music, you can decide for yourself what the rules are. It's up to you. You have total responsibility, and that's why it's the greatest musical thing that I know about. And it's the most difficult, the most challenging, the most rewarding, most fun, the most sad, because you are the one that determine all of the rules.
So yeah, I mean, I think that's a nice introduction to those artists and the ideas. The editors, obviously, I think took their lead from Eddie Prevost, who talks about the music allowing you to make up your own rules. But I thought I would suggest maybe an alternate reading, which is rather than making up its own rules, it's a music that lays down a path in walking. This is a phrase that's often associated with the inactivism or the inactive approach that Francisco Varela and Evan Thompson helps bring into the world, if you like. And there's a wonderful essay by Ezekiel Di Paolo, just from last month, I think, that I thought I would read a little quote from, because he does such a wonderful job of summarizing the main tenets of the inactive approach. Di Paolo writes, "The main tenet of the inactive approach is that we are always already biological, sensory motor, and social bodies engaged in the ongoing adventure of making ourselves and our world together with others and together with our material environment. It is through our participation, our acting in the world, that we can be in the world and a world comes into being. Rather than having a detached relation to our world, one in which we must model it as best we can and then make decisions based on such models, an action is about being in the world and actively participating in it, before any attitude of contemplative detachment is even possible. The world of meaning, our bodies, our history, our future, is not out there to be deciphered, but is always under construction in the meeting of our practice and the socio-material conditions of the world." the essay is about inaction and dialectics, and DePaulo goes on to write about dialectics as the way with which we circle around questions from multiple vantage points in dialogue, often in tension and in development, and the acceptance that in the movement, our ideas change, our concepts evolve. This is at the heart of a dialectical attitude. And with that in mind, the next set of slides are from a sort of mini talk I gave a bit back that I titled Improvisation and the Seven Tropes. I mean, one could certainly come up with more than seven, but these were seven sort of broad ways in which I find researchers and folks that write about improvisation tend to frame the topic. I mean, I have here the Seven Dwarfs just kind of humorously, but you might also think of the well-known Indian fable of the blind man and the elephant. That, and I think the idea I'd like to get across here is that, each of these actually, I certainly don't want to caricature them, and I don't want to dismiss them. And I think there's valuable insight and research, in all of these tropes, so to speak. And in a sense, all of the work we do on improvisation is a kind of narrative trope, if you like. But this idea of, each one, offering a particular perspective, but only in combination or in integration or in complementarity, can we begin to see the whole, if you like. So yeah, the goal is to try to understand the values that animate them. None are value free. All have blind spots and biases. No single narrative captures improvisation's multifaceted nature. Each distills certain experiences and tells part of the story. But I'll very quickly go through the seven tropes, at least that I highlighted. I think the emancipatory one runs strong in the literature, both a kind of musical emancipation and a sociocultural emancipation. And I've tried to insert some authors that have done exemplary work on these topics, just to sort of orient the trope in general. Eckhard Jost's very well-known book on free jazz, one of the first to really kind of treat it as a musical subject worthy of serious exploration. But he focuses primarily on it as a music that's rejecting previous musical conventions. Mike Heffley has a nice turn on how improvisers are often trying to free themselves from conventions, perhaps. But then, of course, the question becomes, have the freedom to, and even the responsibility to do something interesting and together. And then maybe this kind of idea of eventually reaching a kind of virtuosity or freedom in one's own expressions that then, in a kind of Mobius strip fashion, maybe brings you back to having to free oneself from one's own cliches, if you like. From the sociocultural vantage point, I think free improvisation and free jazz have often been explored as a response to exploitation, oppression, racism, colonialism, capitalism, authoritarianism, and much more. So yeah, this, if one were trying to define improvisation using this trope, you might arrive at the idea that improvisation is about the spirit of freedom and rebellion. The enunciatory trope also has a very strong sociopolitical dimension, often seeing or hearing in the music a model for desirable social relations and political formations, something like Jacques Attali's Noise, or Ajay Hebley's important work, and the critical studies in improvisation work group and journal that he put together and others put together. There's also a kind of spiritual enunciatory side to the music that many highlight, of course, in the wake of Coltrane's wonderful career. I highlight Ed Sereth here, but you could find many others. I also like to highlight that one maybe side effect of this enunciatory trope is that often neoliberal economics and politics heard in improvisation and jazz, maybe from the 1980s onward, a kind of beacon for a neoliberal attitude, right? This idea of foregrounding the individual and the improvisatory group making, gets in some ways co-opted, I would say, and Dale Chapman has written wonderfully about this. by the business world and others and the political world. So there's a certain danger in kind of aestheticizing neoliberal business practices in this trope, I think. But yeah, here it would be arriving at a definition of improvisation as either utopian or perhaps capitalistic in nature. There's a long sort of thread of romantic understandings or romanticizing improvisation, everything from thinking about improvisers as geniuses or mad, crazy folks, if you like. Even I think some of the early writing on embodiment that wanted to highlight the intelligent body was perhaps guilty of kind of just flipping the valuation of mind and body without actually interrogating the binary. So yeah, much of this work maybe is guilty of kind of romanticizing. But I would, I guess, point to particularly Edgar Landgraf's wonderful work that highlights how, from a systems theory perspective, many of the ideas that we have about improvisation as an art, and in particular free improvisation, emerged in response to and in connection to these romantic ideals. But here, improvisation is the domain of great individuals or as the product of increasing systemic complexity. There's a cognitivist trope that has run through improvisation research, certainly of the last 50 years or so, often with a computational edge. Much of this work focuses on the cognitive preconditions and constraints that may be involved in improvising music. Jeff Pressing's well-known work, and also Aaron Berkowitz's more recent book. Some of this work, maybe presents or is beholden to a kind of brain-bound view of cognition. And we are learning much from neuroscience, but I think it also needs to be in dialogue with the humanities and others, to make sure that its more brain-bound approach is complemented by other tropes and other ideas. Yeah, the cognitivist view might see improvisation as overlearned behavior put to use in the moment of performance. And again, it's sort of the preconditions and constraints that play a role in improvisers having to essentially on the fly and on the spot come up with new ideas. There's an ecological turn we could highlight, or a trope, in which perception, cognition, and action are seen as coupled, inseparable from motivation and emotion. I imagine many of you are familiar with this work or have contributed to it. In this view, cognition is embodied, situated, distributed, and I list a few of the, I think, leading researchers exploring these ecological ideas about improvisation. Here we could talk about improvisation as a constant readjusting of one's own position and doings vis-a-vis the unexpected input one receives from the other participants or surrounding stimuli. I think closely related to, or at least in my view, closely related to the ecological viewpoint is the emerging ideas about the predictive mind or predictive processing, the idea that mind arises in and is shaped by prediction. Here, improvisation is understood as joint action, embodied coordination, collective attention, and shared intention. I've enjoyed Gary Hagberg's work on this topic, and he gives an idea that, one way that prediction actually shows up for improvisers in the moment of musicking together is this sense of a feeling of a degree of confidence in either what they're doing or sort of where the music or the ensemble is moving collectively. And in a second, I'll highlight some of Clément Canon's work on improvisation as a coordination problem, which I find very intriguing. But here again, I think, needs to be placed within the wider discourse on improvisation from various other vantage points. But yeah, the predictive view of improvisation might see it as anticipatory, playing as if, within a zone of implicit negotiation. There's also important work that is focused on improvisation within sort of post-humanist discourse, if you like. And here I just highlight the many different ways one could come at a post-humanism. And some may be more laudable than others. I think one pitfall is perhaps to either approach it from a dystopic or a kind of utopic perspective, I guess. But the dystopic would be that technological advances are a threat to humanism. Maybe the flip side of that coin is the idea that biotechnology expands human capabilities, and some of the futurist dialogue tends to maybe overplay this particular trope. Maybe the work that I find most interesting is that which destabilizes anthropocentrism. And even this could come in many different flavors, several different flavors. A kind of methodological post-humanism that attempts to account for the networks between the human and the non-human. Actor network theory, maybe most associated with Bruno Latour, who we lost just recently, has played an important role in my own thinking. But another flavor of this would be a critical post-humanism that targets the hierarchies that come with essentialized notions of human nature. And I think there's a lot of exciting work right now that's sort of decentering the human when it comes to music and sound studies and language studies. So here a definition might be: improvisation decenters the notion of a detached, autonomous, and controlling human agent. There's my rather quick, foray through at least 7 tropes of improvisation studies. What I wanted to highlight was, how could we think about these in a kind of dialectic? And I'll just quickly share a couple slides from a very recent book by Anthea Roberts and Nicholas Lamp. It's not about music at all, rather it's about kind of the politics of globalization. But what I found interesting is the kind of methodology that they're trying to advocate for in not merely holding 2 separate ideas together in mind, but in their case, 6 different perspectives on globalization. And well, here I'll read a quote. Complex integrative thinking involves at least 2 steps. The first is the willingness to accept that there are different ways of looking at an issue, and the ability to see problems from different perspectives, a kind of differentiation, again, maybe linking back to an earlier idea. And the second step is the ability to draw insights from each so as to integrate them into a coherent understanding or approach, a kind of integrative impulse. I don't know if you can see too much of this on the left-hand side of the screen, but they found 6 different covers of The Economist magazine, each highlighting a different facet of thinking about, or a trope, if you like, about globalization. The one in the upper left there is the kind of the idea that a rising tide lifts all boats, right? That, across the world, nations and communities are all sort of improving just by the increased standard of living, if you like. Then a left-wing populist. Maybe I won't go through all these because I think the graphics tell you enough, but yeah, I would highlight the increasing gap between the rich and the poor. A right-wing populist might highlight populations that are seemingly being left behind with all of technological and social change. The corporate power trope is the idea that these big 5, maybe, or fewer corporations are commanding so much in terms of resources. And the geoeconomics highlights the nationalism, maybe, if you like, in the sort of competing global superpowers. And then the global threats highlights the sort of shared threat that we all have for trying to maintain a sustainable planet. They initially used the Rubik's Cube because it has 6 sides to sort of show how, we may be flipped between these various sides and how some might even be positioned as opposite one another. But ultimately, the authors argue for a kaleidoscopic method for identifying factual and normative disagreements, as well as common themes and potential alliances across various narratives. Viewing these phenomena through multiple lenses allows us to blend the insights of different narratives and to appreciate these phenomena in their kaleidoscopic complexity. In some ways, different narratives complement each other by reinforcing similar concerns. from different angles, or by shedding light on different aspects of a phenomenon. In other ways, the narratives offer contradictory accounts of what has happened and how to evaluate it. So the kaleidoscopic method, according to these authors, bears a close resemblance to turning a kaleidoscope. With each turn, the colored pieces shift, new reflections are created, and new patterns appear, but there's no end to the process and no single solution to the problem. And they also have this metaphor of dragonfly eyes that, again, kind of highlights, in this case, you know, a kind of 360-degree view and a range of vision. Maybe I won't read this quote to you, but I just wanted to share those as kind of some metaphors from outside of music studies that might be useful. I'm going to, for the remaining time with the presentation, just dive into a little more about social cognition and coordination, the sort of questions of coordination in improvisation, musical improvisation. When I was initially beginning to work more regularly in a pedagogical context with student improvisation ensembles, I initially shared with them this idea of the 3 C's, and I can't even remember where I might have first encountered it, but this idea that when you're improvising with others, you know, in a very sort of broad stroke fashion, you can think about what you're contributing as either copying, complementing, or contrasting what's already going on in the ensemble. And I guess the idea was that at least having some clarity in one's thinking about how one is interacting with others might provide some clarity to the musicking as well. And I think it can have that effect, but I quickly realized that beyond just this question of whether you're going to copy, complement, or contrast, there were some, in a sense, those were all sort of implied that you had to change what you were doing. And I think for particularly maybe developing improvisers, this idea that you have to always be, orienting constantly to what's going on or coming up with something new can be debilitating in some respects. So I added a few more C's. One is the idea that sometimes it's important for the music, I think, and in general, just to sort of stick with what one is already doing, to kind of continue an idea, to see it through, to not allow this kind of sense that change must always be occurring to overtake the music. There's also, it's important, I think, to emphasize to improvisers that there's always the option of not playing, right, of ceasing. Because again, I think it's common for, in particular in larger ensembles, the one potential pitfall is that everybody feels compelled to be playing all the time. And then the 7th C I added was this idea that, you know, what one does doesn't have to always be seen in direct relationship to something else going on in the ensemble, you know, to copy, to complement, or contrast, but sometimes what's needed in the music is to veer off in a wholly new direction. I mean, I share that with, you know, that was just kind of one of my pedagogical strategies for working with improvisers. But some of the literature bears out that these kinds of strategies may be, in fact, in play as improvisers are working together. This is Canon and Garnier, who write about stabilization, wait and see, playing along, intensification, changing the framework of the interaction as sort of emergent strategies in improvisation. Wilson and MacDonald write about maintaining or changing, initiating or responding, and then adoptive, augmentative, or contrastive responses. So, you know, although obviously each one has different language, there's a kind of resonance, I think, between these. So I'm going to dive a little bit into Clément Canon's work on coordination in improvisation ensembles, and then maybe step back from that at the very end. This is from a fairly recent article where the authors talk about the twin problems of consolidation and articulation. Maybe even a paradox, right? The idea that improvisers establish and depart from stable interactional frameworks. You know, this kind of, in some ways, ongoing dynamical tension between wanting to cohere, wanting to consolidate, but also wanting to articulate independence, to sort of scope out new sonic territory, if you like. And as a result, many, not all, but many improvisations have a kind of emergent segmental form in which, there are periods of consolidation, maybe followed by periods of departure or articulation. The authors write, I guess the question is, how do improvisers coordinate this dynamic in an emergent fashion without this explicit planned coordination or a collective goal state? Canon and Saint-Germier highlight at least some possible emergent coordination mechanisms, which all deserve a little more time to explain, but you've probably encountered elsewhere. The idea of entrainment, the idea of affordances, and then also perception-action couplings, either involving common motor representations or motor simulation mechanisms. And these authors at least acknowledge that all of these can and do play a role. Excuse me. But they also sort of conclude that they alone or taken together may still be insufficient to explain how improvisation groups coordinate performances. Since collective free improvisation tends to avoid clear and shared pulse, so entrainment, although entrainment can and does operate even without a cleared meter or pulse, it's a little less obvious in the ways in which it operates. And collective free improvisation also involves heterogeneous ensembles of instruments and performers. So this idea of common motor representations or motor simulation mechanisms, is a little more tenuous, since those at least have been studied most often when performers of the same instrument, for instance, have a kind of common motor representation. And collective free improvisation highlights often idiosyncratic and extended techniques, in which perception-action couplings may be more opaque. The authors essentially explore this idea of compatible goals. So not pre-planned goals or shared goals necessarily, but compatible goals. Compatible goals differ from shared goals in that they do not require that improvisers have a shared understanding of the events constituting their ongoing interaction. The authors give the idea of, just having a compatible goal of, as an ensemble, we're going to maintain an interesting texture for the next couple of minutes, may be enough, for interesting emergent properties. It's not as if the individuals in the ensemble have to have a shared goal of what that texture might be, but just having a compatible goal that together we will explore an interesting texture. Or, of course, the idea of even being able to end an improvisation successfully or effectively requires a kind of compatible goal that, as an ensemble, we're going to conclude the performance together. Other musics, of course, involve verbal communication, or they might have more explicit body gestures during performance. So the question is still, how do improvisers coordinate or communicate if they're avoiding those more explicit ways of coordinating? And the authors suggest that they may use interrupting or contrasting sounds for their intentional content. So not necessarily for their sonic properties, but more as a kind of signaling of intent. They also write about signaling a degree of affiliation by, in some ways, demonstrating that you're playing with or against other folks in the ensemble, or signaling a degree of control. And I think this is apparent to improvisers that have worked together, or just listeners to improvisation, that maybe one individual takes the lead for a given amount of time, and that can help to coordinate. They write about turning transient moments of sync or musical salience, even sort of unexpected or moments of happenstance where things just seem to align briefly or momentarily, into focal points that instantiate compatible short-term goals in the ensemble. And what their research suggests is that more experienced improvisers might be more adept at recognizing these focal points or these moments of salience when they emerge and sort of harnessing them into focal points for the ensemble. And the authors also write about developing coordination smoothers. Certainly as ensembles play together over time, a kind of shared mental model, although maybe not an explicit one, but an implicit shared mental model can develop. And a kind of stable aesthetic identity to a group can develop over time as well. And of course, improvisers vary in whether they embrace that idea of a more or less stable aesthetic identity as a group, or whether they intentionally push against it, or maybe work with other folks in order to avoid too much stabilization. I share those rather quickly, but I think their research offers some intriguing suggestions on how improvisers coordinate. Excuse me. But I think we could also push back a little bit, or at least try to orient it within this larger dialectic. Here, I just wanted to highlight a couple differences between ecological thinking versus game theory that in some ways come from this nice book by Daniel Belgrad about the cultural feedback in the 1970s in particular. But ecological thinking emphasizes the symbiotic functioning of whole systems. That idea of how a group lays down a path in walking would be a nice example. Game theory has certainly evolved over the years, but game theory, at least initially, was focused on conflict situations. Separating the ends from the means depending on sequential logic, the idea of cause and effect, and requiring one to construct hierarchical values, often in advance. In game theory, outcomes are judged by their desirability, while strategies are judged solely by their efficaciousness. Even in coordination games, which of course Canon and his co-authors are exploring, the idea is that players get the best possible payoff by all doing the same thing in many of those coordination games. Of course, in music, as in life, decisions are often made simultaneously, continuously, non-linearly, on multiple levels in a top-down and bottom-up fashion, and values and priorities are not easily identifiable or permanently fixed. Gregory Bateson argues that game theory didn't take deutero learning into account. What applications of the theory of games do is to reinforce the player's acceptance of the premises, and therefore make it more and more difficult for the players to conceive that there might be other ways of meeting and dealing with the other. I mean, here I also will acknowledge that my 7 C's didn't always make for more successful musical improvisations, group musical improvisations. And I think in some ways Bateson is right that, having these kind of these strategies ahead of time can actually sometimes blind us to other ways of coordinating or connecting. And there's a wonderful little book by James Carse called Finite and Infinite Games that highlights that, essentially a finite game is one in which the purpose is to win. An infinite game, the purpose is to continue the play. And life, of course, is an infinite game, but so is music, right? The idea is there are no winners and losers. And if anything, improvisers would hope to create a context in which the play can continue well after the improvisation is over. So yeah, to get to intersubjectivity and embodied mind reading at the very end here, the classical view, which has tended to be linguocentric, is that music is structured and rule governed. Even that idea that improvisation is a music that makes up its own rules, right, still, I think, places a little too much emphasis on the idea of rules. Musical structural features underlie music perception and comprehension. So yeah, again, this kind of individualistic musical semantics. I think the research has moved much more in the direction of interactional musical semiotics, if you like. Both music and languages are practices involving persons in intersubjective experiences that are embodied and temporally situated within sociocultural processes. Maybe I'll just kind of quickly, musical gestures map onto the timing and shape of the body. So that, yeah, I guess you'll hear from Vijay Iyer next. And he, in the early 2000s, did his dissertation on this idea of embodied expressions in musical gesture. But you could go all the way back to Alfred Schutz in the 1960s, who argued that musical expression and perception depend on common ways of shaping gesture in time. Music is an inherently intersubjective phenomenon. I was going to share this, but maybe I'll just kind of click through it. But there's a nice recent article by Gary Hagberg that highlights how we might want to think of the ensemble as a plural subject. You know, again, this idea of laying down a compelling path in walking. Hagberg writes about joint intentional commitment. He actually uses the actual example of people walking together, choosing to go on a walk together. And in so doing, there's a normative expectation that the pair will, in a very tangible sense, walk together as if they are two intermingled and, for the duration of this minimally creative endeavor, inseparable parts of one single walking organism. And I think he very eloquently highlights how, something as simple as just taking a walk with a partner means that you're entering into this sort of plural subject relationship, if you like. Hagberg writes about joint commitment, creating a synthesized joint person, the parts of which act as if they were the limbs or extensions of a single organism. He writes about, often the improvisers have the sense that the ensemble wanted to go in a certain direction. I wrote an article a number of years back called What the Music Wants. I actually just finished a studio project where, I always find it fascinating that even if you're playing, a so-called tune, that has a certain kind of form, what's always exciting is every time you play it, it can sort of have a feeling, a collective feeling that the ensemble wants to take it in a different direction in terms of maybe just the intensity or, or maybe it is something about the harmony or the improvisations. But, it's fascinating to me that even in maybe more explicitly organized improvisational settings, there's always this sense that the ensemble can take on a bit of a life of its own. Individual volition has been supplanted by a co-created plural subject that itself indicates how and where it wants to go, how and where it wants to develop. The practices themselves show this concept in play, and this is true whether or not the concept can be verbally articulated. I think I'm gonna stop there because I'm looking forward to the discussion. So I think I stopped the share. There we go.
Thank you very much.
Oh yeah, well, thank you.